From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The story of nuclear weapons will have an ending, and it is up to us to decide what that ending will be. Will it be the end of nuclear weapons? Or will it be the end of us?
Nuclear arms are back in a big way. That's according to a front-page article in the New York Times today on the Trump administration's newly released nuclear policy plan, which critics say will spark a new nuclear arms race with Russia. We'll go to Geneva to speak with Beatrice Fien, executive director of the Nobel Prize-winning organization, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Then this weekend, House Speaker Paul Ryan touted a story of a woman whose paycheck increased by $1.50 a week as a major benefit to middle-class workers. After ridicule and outrage, he was forced to delete his tweet. We'll speak with economist Richard Wolff. And finally, the Philadelphia Eagles stunned the sports world, beating the New England Patriots in a Super Bowl upset Sunday night, capping an historic NFL season filled with racial justice protests both on and off the field.
We gonna be all right. Hey, we gonna be all right. We gonna be all right.
We, the Black Visions Collective and the Black Lives Matter Global Network, call for divestment from the deadly systems of oppression that harm black people, fracture black families, and disrupt black futures.
We'll go to Minneapolis to speak with organizer Mel Reeves, where 17 protesters were arrested during a racial justice demonstration before the Super Bowl Sunday. And if you watched the game last night, you might have noticed one of the players was knocked out on the field. Or maybe that's why you didn't watch. We'll speak with the legendary sports and movement historian Dr. Harry Edwards about concussions, protests, and more. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration's unveiled its new nuclear weapons strategy, which involves spending at least $1.2 trillion to upgrade the U.S. nuclear arsenal, including developing a new nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. The Nuclear Posture Review calls for developing low-yield warheads, which critics say blur the lines between nuclear and non-nuclear weapons, meaning they're more likely to be used. It also reportedly seeks to expand the number of scenarios under which the U.S. might consider the use of nuclear weapons, including in response to a major cyber attack. Trump's nuclear policy has alarmed arms control experts around the globe and been openly criticized by Iran, Russia, and China. We'll have more on this after headlines. House Republicans are facing backlash after releasing a controversial memo that reports to show the FBI and Justice Department abused their authority by placing Trump campaign advisor Carter Page under surveillance in 2016 over his ties with Russia. On Saturday, President Trump tweeted the memo, quote, totally vindicates him. But the memo actually raises new questions about the actions of the Trump campaign. Supporters of Trump had claimed the FBI used a partisan research document, the Steele dossier, to obtain a surveillance warrant for Page. But the memo actually reveals the FBI's probe of the Trump campaign was triggered not by the Steele dossier, but by the actions of another Trump advisor, George Papadopoulos, who reportedly bragged to an Australian diplomat in May 2016 that the Russians had political dirt on Hillary Clinton. According to the New York Times, Papadopoulos had been told weeks earlier that Moscow had thousands of emails that would embarrass Clinton. Papadopoulos pleaded guilty last October to lying to federal agents. Tensions growing between the United States and Venezuela during a five-nation trip to South America. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the U.S. is considering imposing sanctions and possibly an oil embargo against the oil-rich state. Late last week, Tillerson suggested the U.S. would support the Venezuelan military toppling the elected government of Nicolás Maduro.
I think there will be a change. We want it to be a peaceful change. In the history of Venezuela and in fact the history in other Latin American, South American countries, oftentimes it's the military that handles that when things are so bad that the military leadership realizes they can't serve the citizens anymore, they will manage a peaceful transition.
The Venezuelan Defense Minister, Vladimir Padrillo, criticized Tillerson for hinting at a possible military coup in Venezuela.
When you invite the armed forces to overthrow a government, you are disrespecting an institution that uses its principles, its Republican morality, its historical traditions. We are deeply proud of being the heirs of our liberator.
The New York Times has revealed Israeli drones, helicopters, and jets have secretly carried out 100 airstrikes inside Egypt over the past 2 years, targeting militants in northern Sinai. The covert attacks were done with the approval of the Egyptian President, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, despite decades of strained relations between the two nations that fought 3 wars against each other. New Pentagon data shows the number of U.S. airstrikes in Yemen increased 6-fold last year following the election of Donald Trump. U.S. drones, AC-130 gunships, and fighter bombers carried out 131 airstrikes in Yemen in 2017, up from 21 airstrikes a year earlier. Late last year, U.S. Central Command also confirmed U.S. troops had conducted multiple ground operations in Yemen in 2017. This all came as Yemen was facing a humanitarian crisis and the largest cholera outbreak on record. In South Carolina, 2 people died and 116 were injured when an Amtrak passenger train traveling on the wrong track slammed into a stationary freight train. Rail experts said the accident could have been prevented if technology known as positive train control had been installed on the tracks. The accident marks the 3rd high-profile fatal Amtrak train accident in the last 2 months, 2 in the last week. There's a major new development in the scandal around USA Gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar, who's been accused by 265 women and girls of sexual abuse. According to the New York Times, at least 40 of the victims were abused after the FBI began its investigation of Dr. Nassar in July of 2015. While FBI was conducting probes in 3 cities, no effort was apparently made by USA Gymnastics officials to warn other potential victims of Nassar. Meanwhile, on Friday, chaos broke out inside the courtroom during a sentencing hearing for Dr. Nassar. Randall Margraves, a father of 3 daughters who were all molested by Nassar, attempted to lunge at the doctor in the courtroom.
I would ask you to, as part of this sentencing, to grant me 5 minutes in the locked room of this demon.
I have
Would you do that?
That is not how
Yes or
our... No, sir, I can't
Would you
do
give me
that.
1 minute?
You know that I can't do that. That's not how our legal system works.
Randall Margraves then lunged at the doctor, was handcuffed and removed from the courtroom, but he was later released without charge. In news from Hollywood, Uma Thurman has accused Harvey Weinstein of sexually assaulting her in a London hotel room after they worked together on a 1994 hit film, Pulp Fiction. More than 70 women have now accused the former film producer of sexual misconduct, including rape. In an interview with the New York Times, Uma Thurman said, quote, "The complicated feeling I have about Harvey is how bad I feel about all the women that were attacked after I was. I'm one of the reasons that a young girl would walk into his room alone the way I did." In France, Oxford professor and renowned Islamic scholar Tariq Ramadan has been charged with rape after he was accused by 2 women of rape and sexual assault last year. Ramadan, who has been taken into custody, has denied the accusations. It's been another deadly weekend for migrants trying to reach the shores of Europe. On Saturday, the bodies of at least 20 African migrants were discovered off of Melilla, a Spanish enclave in northern Africa. Meanwhile, on Friday, 90 migrants are feared to have died when their boat capsized off the coast of Libya. Leonard Doyle is a spokesperson at the International Organization for Migration, the IOM.
It's an absolutely shocking tragedy that seems to have occurred off Libya, when we think as many as 90 Pakistani migrants trying to reach a better life ended up through the criminal act of smugglers drowning.
Meanwhile, in Italy, a suspected neo-Nazi shot 6 African migrants on Saturday in a series of drive-by shootings in the city of Macerata. The gunman has been identified as Luca Traini, an Italian man who has a neo-Nazi tattoo above his eye. Last year, he ran for office as a member of the far-right League Party, which has been projected to make major gains in next month's Italian election. And in Minneapolis, 17 people were arrested Sunday before the Super Bowl as they attempted to block a light rail line carrying Super Bowl ticket holders to the stadium. The activists, which included members of Black Lives Matter, said in a statement that they were, quote, using this moment to stand with athletes who've protested throughout the past 2 football seasons and calling attention to the murder of black people by police, unquote. We'll have more on the protests in Minneapolis later in the broadcast. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. A treaty intended to limit the United States and Russia's long-range nuclear arsenals officially takes effect today. But the once promising treaty signed 8 years ago by President Obama is overshadowed by a new nuclear arms race sparked by President Trump. On Friday, the Trump administration unveiled its new nuclear weapons strategy, which involves spending at least $1.2 trillion to upgrade the United States nuclear arsenal, including developing some completely new nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Posture Review calls for developing low-yield warheads, which critics say blur the lines between the nuclear and non-nuclear weapons, meaning they are more likely to be used. It's also reportedly seeks to expand the number of scenarios under which the United States might consider the use of nuclear weapons, including in response to a major cyber attack. As the New York Times reports in a front-page article today, quote, the Pentagon envisions a new age in which nuclear weapons are back in a big way. This is Deputy Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan speaking Friday about the Pentagon's Nuclear Posture Review, known as the NPR.
This review is consistent with U.S. nuclear policies since the end of the Cold War. It reaffirms that the fundamental role of U.S. nuclear policy is deterrence and continues our clear commitment to non-proliferation and arms control. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has worked to reduce the number and role of nuclear weapons. But the world looks different since the last NPR in 2010. The challenging and dynamic security environment requires steady action to strengthen deterrence. This NPR responds to today's security needs with a tailored nuclear deterrence strategy and flexible capabilities for effective deterrence.
Prominent anti-nuclear advocates have denounced the Pentagon's plan as radical and extreme. World leaders have also criticized the plan. Russia said it risked provoking a renewed nuclear arms race. China accused Trump of engaging in a new Cold War. Iran's foreign minister said the plan brings the world closer to annihilation. This comes as the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists advanced the doomsday clock 30 seconds closer to midnight. The clock's a symbolic timekeeper that tracks the likelihood of nuclear war and other existential threats. It now stands closer to midnight than at any time since 1953. The scientists directly cited President Trump's nuclear policies and one of the reasons for advancing the clock. For more, we go to Geneva, Switzerland, where we're joined by Beatrice Finn, the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. It is the latest organization to win the Nobel Peace Prize. It won in December. Beatrice Finn, well, first of all, congratulations on the Nobel Peace Prize, and talk about what's called the NPR, the Nuclear Posture Review, the Trump administration's plans for nuclear weapons, what it means for world peace.
It's a really dangerous new policy. We've already had a very dangerous status quo for many years, and this just increases really the risk of nuclear war. It is a policy that lowers the threshold for using nuclear weapons and develops new types of nuclear weapons that would be easier for President Trump to use. It's dangerous, and it puts us on the path towards nuclear war if we don't act now.
And Beatrice, what are the commitments right now of the United States in terms of lowering or reducing its nuclear arsenal?
But the United States has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which commits it to negotiate in good faith nuclear disarmament. But so far that has not taken place. But it's not just in the United States. All nuclear armed states, including Russia and China, France, UK, are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, upgrading instead of reducing their arsenals.
Let's go to a clip of President Trump giving his State of the Union last week. He said he would beef up the U.S. nuclear arsenal and dismiss global efforts to ban nuclear weapons.
As part of our defense, we must modernize and rebuild our nuclear arsenal, hopefully never having to use it, but making it so strong and so powerful that it will deter any acts of aggression by any other nation or anyone else. Perhaps someday in the future there will be a magical moment when the countries of the world will get together to eliminate their nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we are not there yet, sadly.
During his State of the Union, Trump escalated his rhetoric against North Korea once again, calling the North Korean government depraved, warning it poses a nuclear risk to the United States.
North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear missiles could very soon threaten our homeland. We are waging a campaign of maximum pressure to prevent that from ever happening. Past experience has taught us that complacency and concessions only invite aggression and provocation. I will not repeat the mistakes of past administrations that got us into this very dangerous position. We need only look at the depraved character of the North Korean regime to understand the nature of the nuclear threat it could pose to America and to our allies.
So that's President Trump. Beatrice Finn in Geneva, Switzerland. Can you respond to both? Talking about North Korea posing an increased risk to the United States, and how you see that being resolved, and specifically what is new in what President Trump is proposing in this nuclear posture review. Is it any different what President Obama proposed in the $1 trillion renovation of the nuclear arsenal?
The situation with North Korea is obviously really dangerous. And the United States has one of the biggest nuclear arsenals in the world. It did not stop, it did not deter North Korea from going nuclear. Rather, it encouraged proliferation. And right now we see evidence that deterrence and using nuclear weapons to protect ourselves is not working. It does not create stability and peace in the region. Rather, it escalates tensions. It fuels the crisis and leads us at risk for nuclear war. It is therefore really urgent that we find a diplomatic solution to this. Instead of threatening with more bombs, bigger bombs, we need to move towards a diplomatic solution that does not involve threatening to indiscriminately slaughter civilians. This policy is, of course, it still bases on deterrence, which nuclear policy has done before in the United States, but it makes nuclear war more likely. It lowers the bar for using them. And if we keep doing this, if we keep having nuclear weapons and threatening to use them, they will be used one day.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the other nuclear powers that are also attempting to modernize their arsenals. China has accused the Trump administration of embarking on a new Cold War. Could you talk about that response and also what China is doing or isn't doing?
Each nuclear armed states right now, all of the 9 ones, are involved in big programs of upgrading and modernizing. And we see this trend with the nuclear armed states that they are increasing the role of nuclear weapons in their security doctrines. It's growing in importance for these few states. But the rest of the world is going in another direction. Over 120 countries negotiated and concluded a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons. So we see these two parallel trends in the world, where a few countries, the outliers, are clinging on to these weapons of mass destruction, while the rest of the world is moving beyond that towards a new type of security policy that doesn't involve threatening to indiscriminately murder civilians.
In 2016, we spoke to Setsuko Thurlow, a survivor of the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. Anti-nuclear activist now, has worked as a social worker for decades in Toronto, Canada, serving Japanese-speaking immigrants. She recounted what happened that day, August 6, 1945.
A 13-year-old grade 8 student at the girls' school, and I was mobilized by the Army, like, together with a group of about 30 schoolmates, and we were trained to act as decoding assistants. And that very day, being Monday, we were to start the day's work, the full-fledged decoding assistant. At 8 o'clock, we had the morning assembly, and the Major and I gave us a pep talk. And we said, we will do our best for Emperor's sake. And at that moment, I saw the bluish-white flash in the windows. I was on the second floor of the wooden building, which was 1 mile or 1.8 kilometers away from the ground zero. And after seeing the flash, I had a sensation of floating in the air. All the buildings were flattened by the blast and falling. And obviously, the building I was in was falling, and my body was falling together with it. That's the end of my recollection.
So that was Setsuko Thurlow speaking to Democracy Now! A few months later, she would be with you, Beatrice Finn, in Oslo, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, as you both gave an acceptance speech. You also just returned from Nagasaki, where can you tell us what you did, and also specifically what you think has to be the approach of the United States and other nations in dealing with nuclear war?
Yeah, I was just in Nagasaki, and it was incredibly moving to be at the places. I also visited Hiroshima to see with my own eyes what the places where nuclear weapons have been used. And I think it's a very important thing to do if you're working on nuclear weapons, because this is what we're talking about. I watched the press conference of the Nuclear Posture Review on Friday and was struck by how incredibly sterile and abstract the language is. But we're talking about cities, of schools, hospitals, houses, civilians. That is what nuclear weapons are meant to do, wipe out entire cities. And I think that is the perspective we have to have in order to start solving these problems. We know that if we keep nuclear weapons forever, they will be used again. And when I was in Nagasaki, it was exactly when the false alarm of incoming missile came to Hawaii. And to be there and to hear these stories of survivors of what happens after nuclear bombs are being used, what happens the days after, the weeks after, how people try to rebuild their lives afterwards again, deal with the consequences. And to know that in Hawaii, mothers and fathers were hiding their kids, running for their lives, trying to figure out who to call those last minutes. It's unacceptable that we have this threat still. It is unacceptable that we keep living under this problem, that we can solve it. And states have to really start thinking about nuclear weapons as real weapons. These are not just geopolitical tools. These are big bombs that are waiting to be launched. And a miscalculation, an accident, intentional use, if we do that, it will be a humanitarian disaster that would violate the laws of war that we already agree on. Huge human rights problems, environmental degradation. And it's really urgent that we do something about this before they are being used again.
And Beatrice Finn, when you were in Japan, you were denied a meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. I'm wondering your sense, Japan being the one country in the world that was subjected to nuclear attack, what the posture of the current government of Japan is compared to those in the past on nuclear weapons?
The Japanese government is a very close military ally to the United States and feels like it also needs to be protected by nuclear weapons. And again, this problem is that we look at nuclear weapons as some kind of safety blanket, something that keeps us safe. When it actually increases the threats, it puts us at a higher risk than if we don't have nuclear weapons. If you look at the situation in North Korea, people of South Korea, people of Japan, they don't feel particularly safe right now because of nuclear weapons. Adding more nuclear weapons do not make us more safer. So I think there's a gap in Japan between the people that want to honor the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the people in Tokyo, perhaps, that are very closely allied, and the government that are closely allied to the United States military. But I think there are ways to do both. We just need to stop relying on weapons of mass destruction. We don't have to leave military allies, but we need to stop thinking that indiscriminately killing of civilians is a legitimate defense method these days.
Beatrice Finn, I want to thank you for being with us, Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the latest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. Beatrice Finn accepted the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of her group. When we come back, we turn to the war at home. House Speaker Paul Ryan tweeted a story of a woman whose paycheck increased by $1.50 a week, talking about it as a major victory for middle-class workers as a result of the Republican tax bill. We'll speak with economist Juan Gonzalez.
$1.50 a week. Is that a pay hike worth celebrating? Well, at least it is, according to House Speaker Paul Ryan. On Saturday, Ryan tweeted a link to an Associated Press report, writing, quote, "A secretary at a public high school in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, said she was pleasantly surprised her pay went up $1.50 a week. She said that will more than cover her Costco membership for the year," unquote. After a deluge of ridicule and outrage, Ryan deleted the tweet hours later.
In contrast to the reported $1.50 pay increase, which comes to $78 a year, House Speaker Ryan received a staggering $500,000 in campaign contributions from Charles Koch only days after Ryan pushed through the tax overhaul. The legislation's been massively benefiting corporations and the richest Americans, including President Trump and his own family, and the Koch brothers, who may save as much as $1.4 billion on income taxes every year. Well, to talk more about the Trump administration's economic agenda, we're joined by Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at New School University. He's the founder of Democracy at Work, hosts a weekly national television and radio program called Economic Update, author of a number of books, including Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. So you have the House Speaker tweeting about this incredible victory, as he considered this woman getting a $1.50 raise a week, $78 a year. But he is mocked and ridiculed so much he has to delete the tweet. Your response to this, Richard Wolff?
I take great comfort from the fact that there was this kind of response. The classic move, both of the Republican Party in general and of Mr. Trump, is to give tiny tax benefits to the mass of people in order to distract them from the grotesque inequality of the benefits going to the corporations and the richest people. Exxon Corporation gloated over the weekend that they're going to save $6 billion from this tax cut. So we can see that what this is doing is worsening, not improving, worsening the inequality of the United States in a dramatic way. And for me, as an economic historian, after 30 years, which is the truth of the last 30 years, of a growing gap between rich and poor that everybody recognizes, to pass a tax cut that worsens it rather than softens it is kind of staggering. It's really not about economics anymore. It's about an out-of-control economy in which the few are simply grabbing it all before it disappears.
Richard, I'm wondering what you think the impact might be even of a small increase, because for people who have been used to not having increases in their take-home pay, even a small increase, to what degree that may lull many Americans into thinking, well, look, maybe Trump and the Republicans aren't so bad.
That's what they hope. They hope that if you get a little bit, you'll be so grateful and so happy that you won't pay attention. But here's where it'll come back and bite you, because with this kind of a tax cut, massive reduction in the money that the federal government gets from all these corporations and rich, we know already, because Mr. Ryan, among others, has told us, they're going to be cutting government programs using the excuse that they don't have the money. So the $1.50 that young lady will save, she will then lose more than that in the cutback in government programs upon which she and her family and her community will depend. This is a bad scene for the mass of the American people.
It's very interesting. We just had this segment on nuclear weapons and President Trump's $1.2 trillion plan to increase the nuclear weapons of the United States. That we can afford. Right. Talk about where the money goes and what you see as the alternatives.
Well, I think fundamentally the money is going where Mr. Trump and the Republican Party want it to go. He's building his political support. He's not a popular president. We all know that, despite his tweets. So he has to build. So he gives the military. That's one way to build his support. He gives the big banks and the big corporations a cut. That's another way to build support. He makes symbolic gestures for the rest of the population in hopes of drawing them in. This is a program that is mindless about the economic realities of our society, about the suffering, about the promises he also made in his campaign. It is built on the notion he is going to build his support and the Republican Party, and the rest of the society will just live with where the chips may fall. For me, this is a problem of a system. This is beyond this problem, this reform, that law. You have a system that is out of control. We have so much wealth in the hands of so few that they're in a position to make everything else serve them. That's a classic sign of a decay in a society. And for me, the fundamental shifts that have to happen are the only way you're going to get out of this long series of horrible kinds of decisions, such as saying we can't take care of the secretary's economic needs beyond $1.50 a week, and then, doubling our defense expenditures.
And I'm wondering what in this bill tax bill that was recently passed most astounded you, because clearly there was the cut in the corporate tax and the pass-through companies and the inheritance tax. I mean, what was it that most astounded you about the ability of the Republicans and President Trump to get this through?
All the ones you mentioned, but here's the one that really got me. For years, large corporations have evaded their share of taxes by using a loophole that their lobbyists got into the law years ago, which says if you keep your wealth outside the country, your profits, you don't have to pay the tax here in the United States. You only have to pay when you come back. Year after year, billions were unavailable to Washington to serve our needs as a people because they did that. And instead of saying, you've abused the American economy by this not payment, instead that bill that was passed in December gives them a preferential lower rate than they otherwise would have had to pay.
Gives them amnesty.
That's right. Basically gives them, instead of punishing them for the damage they did, it rewards them by saying, having waited and not paid, now bring it back and you'll pay less than you ever would have before. That is such an upside-down notion of justice and economics logic in taxation. And here's a last point that I do as an economist. If you give government money to poor and middle-income people, they go out and they spend it, and it makes the economy hum. If you give the bulk of government support to the richest, those are the people who don't spend it all because they are already living high on the hog. They save it. They hold it back. They use it for all kinds of things that aren't the kinds of things that make the economy hum. In economic logic, it's much better to give to the middle and the bottom than it is to give even more to the top after 30 years of having done that already.
And what's your response to these corporations that have suddenly now started to voluntarily give their workers a small increase in their base pay?
Well, I brought with me, because I didn't want to make any mistake, the name of the firm, Willis Towers Watson. It's a human resources firm, is the only scientific effort to understand what the companies are doing with their tax cut. They picked at random 333 companies with no less than 1,000 workers each. And here's the results they got. They asked them, are you giving the workers a benefit from your tax cut? If you're not, are you planning to over the next year? If you're not doing that, are you considering it? Here are the results. 3% have given. 4% are planning to give. 13% are considering it. 80% of American corporations haven't done it, aren't planning on it, and are not even considering it. It's a hype, it's a hustle, it's an attempt to fool people by picking a few examples. And there's one more I love. Walmart is giving money. But it turns out the amount that you get depends on how long you've worked at Walmart. Walmart has a tremendous turnover because they don't pay much. Therefore, most people haven't been there very long. They won't get very much. It's a game in which, unfortunately, these companies are complicit with Mr. Trump in the hype that this is not what it actually is.
And unfortunately, the media are complicit in reporting
and they go with it.
So back to that deleted tweet of Paul Ryan, the House Speaker, who said this woman was pleasantly surprised when her pay went up $1.50 a week. She said that will more than cover her Costco membership for a year. The former Obama staffer, John Favreau, tweeted, as a thank you for passing a $1 trillion corporate tax cut, Paul Ryan received $500,000 in campaign contributions from the Koch brothers, which would probably cover the cost of buying a Costco. Okay, so that's the Obama staffer. But how different is what Trump and his allies are doing than what the Obama administration was doing? And what do you think needs to be done?
Well, it's much worse. I want to be fair. What Trump and the GOP are doing is much worse than what the Obama. But you're quite right in your question. It's a difference in degree. It is not a difference in kind. Mr. Obama came in with great hopes, as everyone knows, that there would be changes and there would be a redirection. There wasn't. I mean, to be real brutally honest, there really wasn't. But in the light of what Mr. Trump does, it all kind of looks better. We have a history in America that with each president, the previous one looks a bit better than he did before. So for me, the basic issue is what you say. What has to be done? And for me, here's how it looks. The decisions we see are the decisions made by the people who run the businesses of America, the corporations, the boards of directors, the major shareholders who really do control this economy and have for a long time. If we're not happy with the outcome, which I assume we're not, we've been discussing that, then we have to go to that problem. We have to be willing to change the system. And for me, what I work on is to change the way corporations are run. Democracy Now! I love the slogan. I love your name. I want it in the workplace. I want democracy there for the first time. We don't have democracy at the workplace. We have a tiny group of people at the top, the major shareholders, the boards of directors they select. They make all the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits everybody helps to produce in an enterprise. Why do we allow such an undemocratic system? The decisions at the top, everybody who works there has to live with, and yet there's no accountability. The mass of people who work in each enterprise can't control, don't elect, have no role. They live with it, but they have no participation. That's the opposite of democracy. I don't think if we put the people in charge of our businesses, if we make the economy run by the people in each enterprise, I think for the first time we'd have an economy that serves people rather than asking all of us to serve an economy run by a tiny minority.
I wanted to ask you about the Trump administration's regulatory direction, because clearly after the financial crisis, there was an attempt during the Obama administration to provide more brakes and controls on the worst excesses of the financial industries. But now we're seeing payday lenders. We're seeing the old student loan companies that were constantly peddling debt to America's young people, all having a resurgence. The impact of the regulatory changes that are occurring.
Probably more profound than anything we've been discussing right now. Under the surface, because there's so much of it going on, even the media can't quite keep up. Underneath the visible is a change in the personnel in which, one after the other, lobbyists from every industrial group are being brought in to be regulators of what they used to work for. I mean, it really is the foxes guarding the chicken coop on a mass basis. And I think what you're going to see slowly is a radical alteration in which the government looks the other way as each industry group gets to do what they've tried to do for decades and been held back from, more or less. Now it's open season. And we will have, and I suspect you will have to cover, more and more stories. And the most recent one is the one in which the fast food industry lobbyist has become the person hired to determine American dietary rules. It's extraordinary what you're seeing and how that will play out in the little moments of our lives.
Talk about that. Jerome Powell taking charge as the economy stutters, says the New York Times.
Yes, well, you know, the Federal Reserve, we pretend in America that we're a private enterprise economy, but we all depend on the Federal Reserve, which is basically a governmental or largely governmental agency that has unspeakably enormous power. How much money there is in the economy, what the interest rates are shaped by the Federal Reserve. Janet Yellen, a classmate of mine, by the way, when I was in graduate school in economics, has left and replaced by Mr. Powell, who's closer to the Republicans and closer to the president than before. My guess is you're going to see a Federal Reserve accommodating, like everybody else, this deregulatory, shift wealth to the top kind of mindset. So unfortunately, where Ms. Yellen might have been a bit of a break, this is full speed ahead in a direction I think is disastrous for this country.
Well, the last question, and that is, how has Trump sold it to the American people with the help of the media, even if they are an opposition media sometimes? What is the note he has struck that he has so succeeded in what you see as duping people?
I think it goes back to your point about Obama. In fact, promises were made to the American people in the Obama administration to bring hope, to bring change, and there wasn't much of any. And I think it turned a large number of people off, and they were discontented and turning away from politics. And there's a kind of anger and rage against what's happening, and Mr. Trump has tapped into that, and he keeps playing on that. I'm the naughty boy. I'm the different one. I'm going to do what others fear to do. It's theater. There's no reality to it. He's actually gone in the opposite direction. But this endless tweeting and the endless crisis mongering with his promises is a kind of distraction meant to keep people away from understanding that what they hoped for with Obama and were disappointed in is going to be an even bigger disappointment with this one.
We want to thank you so much for being with us. Richard Wolff, professor of economics at University of Massachusetts, Amherst visiting professor at the New School, founder of Democracy at Work, hosts a national television and radio program called Economic Update. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Super Bowl happened last night. Huge upset in the sports world with Philadelphia Eagles winning for the first time. If you were watching, did you notice that someone was taken off the field with a concussion? Or maybe that's why you weren't watching last night. We'll talk about what happened on the field and off. 17 people were arrested in racial justice protests outside. Stay with us. All Right by Kendrick Lamar. Protesters in Minneapolis sang his song on Sunday night as they blocked a light rail line carrying Super Bowl ticket holders to the stadium as a protest against racial injustice. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the Philadelphia Eagles stunned the sports world by beating the New England Patriots Sunday night in Minneapolis with a 41-33 win in Super Bowl 52, the first ever Super Bowl title for the Eagles. The game capped an historic season for the National Football League in which African-American players staged league-wide protests against racial injustice and police brutality by taking a knee during the national anthem before games. In Minneapolis, just hours ahead of the Super Bowl, several dozen members of Black Lives Matter and its supporters blocked a light rail station near the U.S. Bank Stadium in frigid temperatures to protest against racial injustice. They all wore sweatshirts that read, "You can't play with black lives." During the action, one protester read a list of demands.
We, the Black Visions Collective and the Black Lives Matter Global Network, call for divestment from the deadly systems of oppression that harm black people, fracture black families, and disrupt black futures. Here in Minneapolis, We call for an immediate freeze of police hiring. No more cops. We call for the police budget to be rolled back until our tax dollars no longer fund the harassment, brutalization, and murder of black people.
About 17 protesters were arrested in the action. And again, if you watch the Super Bowl, you may have noticed that Patriots wide receiver Brandon Cooks was knocked out on the field and left the game with a concussion. Or maybe that's why you didn't watch. Well, for more on the protests and new research on concussions, as well as what happened outside the stadium, we're joined by two guests. In Minneapolis, Mel Reeves, longtime human rights activist, organizer of Take a Knee Conference, and in Palo Alto, California, we speak with the legendary sports and movement historian, Dr. Harry Edwards, professor emeritus of sociology at University of California, Berkeley, author of a number of books, including The Revolt of the Black Athlete, reissued last year for its 50th anniversary edition, was the architect of the 1968 Olympic Project for Human Rights, which was, well, resulted in the most famous photograph from the Olympics. That's right, 1968, Mexico City, the Black Power salute. This is Democracy Now! Mel Reeves, let's go to you first in Minneapolis. Talk about why 17 people got arrested, why you were outside protesting.
How are you? I think there was a little confusion. I'm from Take a Knee Nation, and actually we organized a conference called Race, Police Violence, and the Right to Protest over the weekend, where we had about 15 mothers that traveled to the Twin Cities from all over the country, and they told their stories and made it the problem of police violence is just the stark reality that it is. We also had young people who had taken a knee from around the country join us, and so what we had was a anti-police violence. So there were like 3 actions yesterday. So I'm sorry about the confusion. I'm actually not Black Lives Matter, but Take a Knee Nation had representatives from Cincinnati, Boston, New York, Chicago, and a few other places. They were out next to the stadium yesterday, and we protested and we called for police violence at the end of our conference. And our conference was 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, where people got a chance to hear from these families who had lost their children to police violence, and also young people who had taken a knee. And out of that conference, we came up with a few demands ourselves. One is that we demand that the police, anytime they mistreat a citizen, that they are punished and held accountable and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And then we're demanding that all the cases be reopened. And what this is about, it's like after the civil rights movement was successful, they went back and looked at the cases in which black people had been mutilated and murdered and raped, and no one was held accountable for. So after the civil rights movement and everybody, there was agreement that Jim Crow and segregation and the terrorism of black people was not accepted. It became acceptable to go back and look at those cases and actually convict folks because they had clearly done wrong. And in this case, there are very, very few justifiable killings of the police by anybody, not just black folks. So those are where our central demands coming out of our conference.
And Mel Reeves, what about remind our viewers and listeners around the country the particular conditions in Minneapolis in terms of police abuse and police killings over the past year or two?
Yeah, that's a good question. You would think that, and it would seem like this would not be a place where that occurs, but as you guys have talked about, I think, we have some great disparities. So just recently, Justine DeMond was killed under some really questionable circumstances, and she's a white woman, actually, and she called the police to respond to what she thought was some kind of domestic disturbance, or she heard some woman screaming in the alley in a nicer neighborhood, actually, in Minneapolis, and she ran out to, I guess, to direct the police or whatever, and she wound up dead. We still don't know why she was killed. And you all are familiar with the case of Philando Castile, where he was stopped by the police, tried to tell the police that he had a registered firearm, and after he told him that, the officer, Geronimo Yanez, and we saw it, you saw it on film pretty much, he just opened up on him. Before that, we had Jamar Clark, who was at a friend's house playing cards. One of his girlfriends hurt her ankle. The EMTs came. He came out actually to check on her. Somehow the EMTs misunderstood what he was doing. They called the police, and next thing you know, they threw him on the ground, and the next thing you know, there were people there actually around it. You know, he's shot and killed. Before that, we had Terrence Franklin, and before that, we've had other cases. So, yes, this is Minneapolis is as much America as any place else.
I want to bring Dr. Harry Edwards into this conversation as you listen to Mel Reeves talking about the protest at the Super Bowl, which, if you were watching the Super Bowl, you would probably have very little idea was happening outside, but also what happened on the ground inside the stadium. I don't know how many people notice. Yet another football player has his head slammed, taken off the field with a concussion. Talk about your concerns right now in this year of NFL protests with so many players taking a knee, though we didn't see that last night.
Well, I think, first of all, the movement has dispersed to the point that it has no real center and no central management, no central set of goals, no central leadership. The athletes who incited this movement, this Take a Knee movement, are not the leaders of it. They're the icons of it. And just as the last guest said, there's confusion about even what they were doing outside of the stadium and around the city of Minneapolis. It's going to continue to disperse, and eventually will begin to fade, just as the Black Power movement did, and so forth. This is not to say that these issues will not continue to be important, which is why we have to focus on the issues and not the protest method. There will be other issues that are already well this side of the sports political horizon that will come into play, one of them being the whole concussion situation. The concussion problem is going to generate an NFL league, an elite collegiate football game that is overwhelmingly black. And again, if you go back and just look at the last national championship game at the collegiate level between Clemson and Alabama, it looked like Ghana playing Nigeria. I think they both fielded virtually all black defenses, and a majority of the players on the field at any particular time were black. So that trend is going to continue, which is going to make the concussion issue basically a racial issue at some point, because you're going to have 80% fans in the stands who are white. You're going to have an overwhelmingly white management and directorship at both the collegiate and the professional level, where the overwhelming majority of owners are white. The commissioners of the Super 5 conferences are white. You're going to have overwhelmingly white head coaches, but the people on the field taking the hits and getting the concussions are going to be black. That is going to turn in at some point to a racial issue that is going to have to be resolved. So all of these problems are already well this side of the horizon, but the Take a Knee movement, the movement that was incited by Eric Reed and Colin Kaepernick at the San Francisco 49ers, where I'm still a consultant, that is going to begin to disperse. Not even giving Kaepernick a job in the league would help stem this dispersal of the movement at this point, any more than giving Rosa Parks her seat back would have helped disperse the Montgomery or end the Montgomery bus boycott movement. So we're in a very interesting place at this time, and I think that the trying to frame up and define leadership and specific goals for the movement is going to become increasingly difficult.
Harry Adams, I want to ask you in terms of the response of the National Football League to the protests. It's become increasingly desperate in its attempts to prevent protests from becoming public, to a degree now that the NFL is creating some kind of social justice fund that they're trying to convince the athletes is their response to the issues that were raised in the Take a Knee movement.
Yes. One of the things that happened during the course of this whole movement was that Roger Goodell, he and I have had an ongoing conversation going back to his very first weeks on the job about how you move this whole process from protest to progress, because this is not something that originated in football. It's something that came over the wall of the stadium into football that now football has to deal with. This was something that I warned him about the very first week or two that he took the job that this was coming. And what the league now is trying to do is to develop a coalitionary, collaborative relationship with players to see what they can do in terms of putting resources into that effort to move from protest to progress. Now, some people say, well, that's all well and good, but the devil's in the details. Well, the devil's in the details is one of those old saws and popular wisdom conventions that is absolutely untrue. You're not here today and gone tomorrow. You're here today and gone today. If you're gone tomorrow, you live forever. Imitation is not the sincerest form of flattery. Theft is. So the same with this. The devil isn't in the details. The devil is in the delivery. And it's going to come down to what the league is actually able to deliver relative to this situation in terms of money, in terms of collaborating with players to put the programs together. But in the end, it's going to come down more to what they establish as a model for dealing with other issues that are already well this side of the sports political horizon, including the concussion thing, more so than what they do in terms of this particular problem. This problem is going to be resolved in the community with efforts like the first guest talked about. It's going to be resolved in the community when you bring together all of the various stakeholders in that situation and get them around the table. The NFL is not going to solve the problem of police-community relations. They can contribute, but the biggest thing to come out of this will be a model for them to work with players in terms of handling other issues as the league becomes blacker.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Dr. Harry Edwards, Professor Emeritus of Sociology, University of California, Berkeley, a consultant with the 49ers, and also Mel Reeves with the Take a Knee Nation in Minneapolis. We're going to do part 2 and post online at democracynow.org. We have a full-time news fellow opening at Democracy Now! You can submit your application by February 5th. Find out more at democracynow.org. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Perrin. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.